Welcome to all of you. It is so wonderful to welcome you to Wellesley. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here tonight for this very, very special evening. As you know, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Albright Institute, a remarkable milestone for one of Wellesley's most important initiatives. For 10 years, the Institute has engaged students in understanding and addressing the most urgent issues of our time through a dynamic, interdisciplinary approach. Central to its mission and to Wellesley's mission is the belief that the surest way to bring positive change to the world is by educating and empowering women to be leaders. During their time here, Albright Fellows learn to work across difference, build bridges, work collaboratively, adopt a global perspective, and grow into the kind of leaders our communities and that our world needs today. I'd like to begin by thanking the individuals who help make their experience in this institute during winter sessions so extremely successful. I want to say a special thank you to you, Secretary Albright, and I speak for the entire college when I say that our admiration and gratitude to you are boundless, and that we are always honored to not only have you here with us, but mostly to call you ours. And it's especially exciting to welcome you this year as we celebrate the Institute's 10 years of fostering the next generation of global leaders. Stacy, Professor Goddard, Stacy, where are you? Oh, there you are, okay. We are so fortunate to have you as our faculty director of the Albright Institute. The energy, brilliance, and dedication that you've brought to this role in your first year as faculty director has truly been transformative. I'm so grateful to you and to Rebecca Gordon, the Institute's director, for your leadership. The faculty leadership, along with the incredible staff, make this winter session a remarkable experience every year and make it possible for the Institute to do such important work throughout the year. So, Stacy, you follow in the outstanding footsteps of Professor Joe Joyce and Takis Metaxas, who preceded you as faculty directors, and we owe a debt of gratitude to all of you, so thank you. I also want to welcome our fellows in the audience. Now, I unfortunately could not be at your presentations, but I have heard that they were truly outstanding. I hope that you, yes. I actually asked one of the fellows whether tomorrow when we have the closing exercises where we might hear a little summary, and she said, oh no, the presentations are over. They're over. So I will be reading the executive summaries. But I hope that your experience over the past 3 weeks has been both challenging and inspiring, and that it's reinforced the vital importance of collaboration confronting entrenched global challenges. I'd also like to welcome back and thank our Albright ambassadors, our trustees and former emerita trustees, and the world-class roster of Albright faculty and presenters who are here tonight. Ambassador Nuland, we are so delighted and honored to have you join us this evening to take part in this very special celebration entitled Leading on a Global Stage. Ambassador Victoria Nuland is the former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. A U.S. diplomat for over 3 decades, she was responsible for U.S. policy and diplomatic relations with 50 countries in Europe and Eurasia, with NATO, the European Union, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. During her time in the State Department, Ambassador Nuland was the key architect for President Obama's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. She led U.S. teams supporting the Cyprus peace talks, worked with Turkey on the counter-ISIL campaign in Syria, and promoted energy security and diversification across Europe. She holds a lifelong appointment as Career Ambassador, the State Department's highest rank. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Wellesley class of '59, is one of the leading figures of her generation. She was the first woman to become Secretary of State, the highest-ranking woman in the history of the U.S. government, when she was confirmed in that role in 1997. Her distinguished service to this country has cemented her reputation as a visionary and path-breaking, bold, and principled leader. She's the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, presented by President Obama in 2012. Secretary Albright is renowned across the world as an advocate for women's education, leadership, and equality. Her legacy here at Wellesley can be seen in 10 years of Albright Fellows who are already shaping our world in so many positive ways. Perhaps one of the most powerful tributes I can share is how often our students name her as their role model, and how time and time again they say they aspire to follow in her footsteps. Welcome, Madam Secretary. The conversation will be moderated by our own Professor Smitha Radhakrishnan, the Luella Associate Professor of Women's Studies and Associate Professor of Sociology. A feminist ethnographer of gender and globalization, Professor Radhakrishnan's scholarship illuminates how the local and global reflect and challenge one another. Her scholarship examines the institutional context of work, finance, and international development in urban India, the United States, and South Africa. She is the author of Appropriately Indian, Gender and Culture in a Transnational Class, and is currently engaged in a book project that examines for-profit microfinance in India. It is a profound pleasure to welcome Ambassador Nuland to Wellesley, to welcome back Secretary Albright, and to welcome both of them along with Professor Radhakrishnan. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to moderate this discussion. Thank you both so much for taking the time to be here. It's truly a privilege and an honor to speak with both of you. The theme for tonight is leadership on a global stage. And perhaps the first question to ask for each of you is what your paths have been into that global stage. Perhaps we can start with you, Ambassador Nuland. I understand both of you had very different paths and would love to hear a little bit about what that path looks like.
Well, thanks. First, let me thank you all for having me. What incredible energy in this room. I've had such a good time talking to your scholars and your alumni, and it's an amazing place. It's an amazing place, and it's an amazing program as well. Clearly, people have had a fantastic experience over these 3 weeks and 10 years of alumni. Not too bad, boss, not too bad. How did this happen? I have no idea. 32 years of diplomacy. I was telling somebody that I came into the Foreign Service a year after college, thinking I'd have a 5-year free foreign adventure, and then I'd decide what I wanted to be when I grew up. And what happened to me was I just had an amazing time, and I had this weird Forrest Gump-like career where I kept on landing in places where history was turning under me. And so how do you give that up when you've been in Moscow when the coup happens and the Soviet Union breaks up, when you've been at NATO when it declares Article 5 for the first time in its history, when you've gotten to stop a war with the likes of Madeleine Albright, who was fierce in the interagency about doing the right thing. I just had a great time, and I never left until, and this is, maybe too political for this room, but until And I worked for 5 presidents of both parties, and I worked happily for Republicans and Democrats. I have the bizarre honor of having worked very happily in the personal office of Dick Cheney and the personal office of Hillary Clinton in one lifetime. But I decided when I started to hear about a different view of the U.S. role in the world that it was time for me to retire when this president took office, and then had a sort of change of career, joining the secretary's firm where we do commercial diplomacy, and we can talk a little bit about what that is, but it's another way of keeping those connections going globally between business and government, and it's been great fun.
I have to say that one of the honors of working in the U.S. government is finding a friend and a professional of the character of Victoria Nuland. We have known each other now for a long time. I have depended on you, you have depended on me, and I think it's the epitome of a person who is dedicated to America, and I think the kinds of things, the fact that you've worked for a number of different presidents and different secretaries of state, and dedicated yourself to serving America, and you have done it in an exemplary way. We are very good friends, and I think that the other part of this, and we can talk about it a little bit more, in terms of there are official aspects, but having personal relationships make a difference, and respect for the kinds of things that happen. And I truly do think for those of you that are thinking of going into the Foreign Service, there is no better example than Victoria Nuland, who has dedicated her life because she is a dedicated person on foreign policy, but also in representing the United States. And so I'm very glad that we are now able to continue to work together because, and I think one of the points that I wanted to make during the course of the few days is that personal relationships make an awful lot of difference. And what you want when you are in government or in business is to be able to work with people whom you trust, and that you understand and trust their instincts. And I feel that way about Victoria. So I think there are many different examples about our work together, but I think the professional capabilities are so great. And so I'm very glad you were able to come up to my college. And
This is a cool place.
yeah, so I can
get it
show
now.
off what Wellesley is really like. And Wellesley has been the basis of my whole career. And I am totally grateful to this place in every way for having been a major part of making me a capable human being and a problem solver. So thank you, and thank you for being here. And by the way, President, for explaining who I am, because not everybody always knows. I was coming back from China not long ago, and I was going, Chicago was the first port of entry, and I put my stuff down on the conveyor belt, and the lady behind me said, "So where'd you get all those screw-top bottles? My bottles all leak." And I said, "Well, I got them at the Container Store." And this relates to one of the presentations today. I'm going through the magnetometer, and the TSA guard looks at me, and he says, "Oh my God, it's you." He said, "I'm from Bosnia, and we all love you in Bosnia. And if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a Bosnia. And you're always welcome in Bosnia. And can I have my picture taken with you?" So we have our picture taken, the whole line gets screwed up. And then I go back, and the lady of the screw-top bottle says, "So what exactly happened here?" And I said, "Well, I used to be Secretary of State." And she said, "Of Bosnia?" So thank you, Paula. But that's why the presentation on Bosnia was so important, and I'm very glad that you guys chose it.
But boss, you did not answer the question. How did you fall into this life?
Well, how I
Wellesley.
felt, by the way, I am the daughter of a diplomat, and my father was ambassador, the Czechoslovak ambassador to Yugoslavia. And the little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport, that's what I did for a living. And when we came to the United States as a result of the communists taking over, I was constantly and always interested in foreign policy. other people may have other discussions in their families. All we ever talked about was foreign policy. And when I came to Wellesley, I was a poli-sci major, and I was endlessly interested in all the issues, but I wanted to be a journalist. I won't go through that whole story, but it never, ever occurred to me that I would be Secretary of State. One of the worst things that is said about women is she's ambitious. But so people thought that I had planned the whole thing, but I had not, and I was very surprised when it happened. I think most of the system was very surprised when it happened, and an awful lot had to do with the background that I got at Wellesley and in graduate school, and my interest in politics, because I do think, and this is the part that's important, is if you're going to do foreign policy, you do need to understand domestic policy also, and understanding what makes people vote the way they do and what they do. And so I spent a lot of time on that. And frankly, it never occurred to me. I was very delighted to become ambassador to the United Nations. It was a very good and interesting job at the time. And what happened was that, and you would understand this better than most, is that the cabinet, President Clinton wanted to make the job of ambassador to the UN a cabinet position, which meant that I was part of what is known as the principals group of the National Security Council in terms of making policy. And it was at a time when things were really different after the end of the Cold War, and we had a sense that there were a lot of things that could be done. And I loved being ambassador to the UN as a cabinet member, and I got to know Hillary Clinton very well. The Wellesley connection, we didn't know obviously she's 10 years younger, we didn't know each other before, but she played a very large role in being supportive. And by the way, one of the things, this 10th anniversary is really dedicated to looking at the 25th anniversary of the Beijing conference, and that was one of the really important parts of how we knew each other. By the way, I'm often asked about life balance issues. The perfect thing that I have to explain is that I had to leave my own daughter's wedding reception in order to go and meet Hillary to go to Beijing. And so you have to tell about your life balance issues. It is not easy to be a woman in these jobs, but what really happened is my relationship with Hillary was really key to a lot of it, and Wellesley was a very good connection. But can you tell your life balance?
I'll tell my life balance, my favorite life balance story from the State Department, because it involves Secretary Albright. But just to remind that the U.S. Foreign Service always admitted women, but it didn't allow women to be married until 1972, because there's that pesky, spouse problem, that pesky children problem, and you couldn't possibly be a diplomat if you had those encumbrances, right? So even when I had my kids in 96 and 98, it was not very common to see women on the 7th floor of the State Department massively pregnant, as I was with both my first and my second. My first one, I remember Secretary's predecessor was, I can see him and I can't remember his name, Warren Christopher, who was a very buttoned-down, dapper Washington character, a lovely, lovely human. And I remember waddling into his office for a meeting on Russia at 8.5 months pregnant with my first one. And he looked at me and with a straight face, and without thinking this was an un-PC thing to say, said, "Toria, you're scary." And after that, I decided I would skip his meetings, and I gave birth about 10 days later. So it was, after completing hours of briefing books for a trip my boss was going on. But my favorite story, in 1998, when Secretary Albright is in the job, the Kosovo War is blazing. Milosevic is rampaging across Kosovo, ethnic cleansing. This is the second time we've seen this movie. We've been through it in Bosnia, and frankly, the United States would not have entered the Bosnian War without this woman sitting to my left, who, as I said, was absolutely fierce on the immorality of the U.S. sitting on the sidelines while a genocide was going on, and ensured that we did the right thing. But then it happens all over again in Kosovo. We have a NATO 50th anniversary summit in Washington where Yeltsin and Clinton have a 3-hour meeting, after which it's decided that we will engage in a shuttle diplomacy to try to find a way to end this war with Russia's participation. And my boss at the time, Secretary Albright's deputy, Strobe Talbot, were going to get on a plane in 3 hours. The only problem was I was still nursing my second kid. So I'm taking the breast pump, and we're going back and forth on a weekly basis to Moscow and NATO and meeting up with Secretary Albright. And at a certain point, I detach from Strobe and join the Secretary's party. We are on a transatlantic flight, and in those days, there's no such thing as an outlet on a transatlantic flight. We get off the plane, and Secretary says, "Everybody in my room for a pre-brief, 20 minutes. And I had to say to her and to her aide, "Can I please have 40 minutes? I got a little emergency here with the kid," which she allowed.
But I do think the stories about women and what you said, that once a woman got married, she had to resign.
Yes.
And I often say that there was a time when the only time that a woman could make an impression as a diplomat's spouse was to pour tea into an ambassador's lap. But it changed, and I really do think that the issue of tandem couples and having more women in the Foreign Service made a big difference, and you played a very important role. And I do think that more women are needed in the Foreign Service. And just generally, if I might say, it's not a detour in this conversation, but what has been happening to the Foreign Service is outrageous. These are people that are dedicated servants of the United States. And you knew Ambassador Yovanovitch very well. And I think that what needs to happen for those of us that have had anything to do with the Foreign Service, we have to stand up for the people that are really working hard to represent our country. I have been asked to join. It was very interesting. There is now a diplomacy caucus on the Hill where they are specifically dedicated to trying to figure out how to be more protective of the Foreign Service, of people who have dedicated their lives. And I think, Toria, you're such a good example of having been able to work for different administrations because your dedication was to representing the United States. And I think that we need to understand what it is that our diplomatic service actually does. And without diplomats, we can never get anything straight.
Well, thanks for that. Just to say, all of you fabulous Wellesley graduates, take the Foreign Service exam. You don't have to say yes when they give you your offer, but make it an option because we need your talent.
But we do need more women in the Foreign Service, and it's not easy, and there are people that are great examples, and Toria was a great and is a great defender of America.
Just to continue on that, along those lines, what can you say a little bit more about what exactly, like, what is the importance? Why is it so critical to have women in diplomatic positions specifically? Sometimes it's important to kind of lay out what exactly we are bringing to the table in those kinds of contexts. Would be great to hear a little bit about.
Well, I do think that women do have great negotiating skills and work very hard without offending half the people in this room. Women really do work harder than men, and I think are really have been an addition to the diplomatic service. I would also say that we have a way of being able to compromise and being diplomatic. I'm not sure Toria was always diplomatic.
Never.
So she's an exception. She made it just on pure brain power. But I do think that there is something, I think in order to make a country strong, you need to have the people that are the best trained to do the job, whatever gender they are and how they operate. And I think that it's a loss when women are excluded from things. What was very interesting, that there's been more of a sense of what they call tandem couples, which is both the husband and wife being in the diplomatic service. It makes it hard because sometimes they are sent to different places or close enough but not really. But there has been an attempt to try to diversify the diplomatic service. That is not what's going on now, which is why I do think that it's essential to have the conversations about why diplomats are important. And Tori, I think you'd agree on that. What has bothered me is that people think that diplomacy is this fancy thing where people just go to receptions. It is a very dangerous job, and when I was in office, there were more diplomats that had died in service than flag officers. And we had the names on the wall, and it's a dangerous job and not one that is just fancy. And I think it takes dedication. And so I do hope that people know that it's a great career and that it's a very important one to have very experienced and good diplomats.
I mean, my answer to that is all those things, obviously, the negotiating skills. I would say there is a quality of listening which is essential to finding the middle and to hearing where the compromise might be. There's a quality of trying to get under the words and understand where the ambition is, where the politics are, where the fear might be, which helps you to crystallize the motivation on the other side, whether it's the individual you're talking to or the individual representing the nation. And I think women are good at that for whatever reason, because of the way we're brought up or because of what we navigate. There is multitasking and lots of balls all the time. You know, as a secretary will tell you, you get one problem solved and the world blows up somewhere else. So there's that ability to hold lots of thoughts in your head at the same time. And there is that essential quality that I always admired and that inspired me to work that much harder for my two Wellesley women secretaries, Secretary Albright and Secretary Clinton, which is a deep morality and empathy and desire for the United States to do the right thing in the world, not just for itself, but for a larger community. So I think some of those things are very strong in women who choose this career. The other thing I would say is when I became a boss, first when I led the NATO mission, then in the press job, and then in EUR, the Europe Bureau, we would never talk about work-life balance for women. We would talk about work-life balance for everybody. Now, was my experience of raising two kids and dragging a husband around the world and having to, you know, make compromises in terms of career and family, part of my experience that made me want everybody in the service to have that? Yes, but I think it's particularly generous and important when women of your generation are thinking about creating those conditions for everybody. Because you don't want to be married to somebody or dragging a partner around who has an inflexible life or who doesn't want to play a full role in the family. So it's also incumbent on us to make that possible for our partners of any gender.
One of the things that you mentioned in passing was that you have, I've never been diplomatic. It seems like there are two very different leadership styles that are going on between you, or maybe there are some commonalities, and I would love to hear a little bit about that. You mentioned how much Secretary Albright's fierceness really stuck with you when you first met her. So, you know, whether you want to talk about one another or talk about your own leadership styles, I think it would be wonderful to hear a little bit about that.
If you Google me, you will find I famously got caught cursing on a phone call in the middle of the Ukraine crisis using an F-bomb that, you know, President Obama could very easily have fired me for, and instead he wrapped his arms around me when he heard about it and said, you know, they can go. They know where they can go. But I was encouraged and inspired to say what I thought by the fantastic mentors that I had before. First and foremost, Secretary Albright, who always said what she thought was the right thing to do and fought everybody around the table if they didn't see the moral way to go, and usually won.
But I do think that we were together at a very interesting time in American history, and it was the end of the Cold War, and there were a lot of changes taking place, and it was very important to have somebody like Toria who had the background and the interest to really delve into the issues. And Strobe Talbot was my deputy, and we really spent an awful lot of time dealing with the issues of the end of the Soviet Union, expanding NATO, doing a number of things together. I do think that the Bosnia issue was one of the most difficult things that we had to deal with, and it was a question because there was a question about what we should be doing in the Balkans. And the Bush administration before us had decided that it was a European issue and that we didn't need to do anything about it. And what was interesting, and the politics of the issue, some of you may remember this, but when Governor Clinton was a candidate, he had said that he would do something about Bosnia. And then when he got into office, it was the economy stupid and gays in the military, and things kind of took away from the necessity of doing something. And I was in New York as ambassador, and we had made all these points about doing something about Bosnia. So on a regular basis, what would happen would be that countries would, or representatives would come up to me and say, why aren't you doing something? Because the reports on ethnic cleansing and a lot of what you guys were talking about in your presentation were going on, and why weren't we doing something? So one of the interesting things is, and we've talked about this a little bit, there is this principals committee that is made up of cabinet secretaries and other members, and I was the only woman on it. And I think one of the issues that we've talked about is what is it like to be the only woman in the room? So what happened was that I did believe that we needed to do something about this. And so in this principals meeting, by the way, the Pentagon are the best briefers in the world. They have 3D, and General Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He had a little red indicator. And
The PowerPoint slides. Yeah.
Really incredible.
They show you that you need a gazillion thousand troops
Absolutely.
to do anything.
Right.
Yeah.
And he would say, we can do this, but what is your exit strategy? But the main thing he said at the end of this one presentation, he said, and what are you going to say to Sergeant Slepchak's mother when he has died as a result of stepping on a landmine? So he lead you up the hill and drop you off the other side. So I then said, and by the way, he would come into meetings. He had just won the Gulf War, the hero of the Western world. We were new. He came into meetings with medals all over. And I sat down and I said...
You had some measly brooches, right?
Well, that's how it started. So what happened was I said, General Powell, what are you saving your military for? And he was furious at me. He then leaves, and General Shalikashvili comes in and he wants to do something, and we used force. So General Powell wrote a book. And all of a sudden I get a call from a press saying, what do you think about what General Powell said about you? And I said, well, what did he say? He said, well, Ambassador Albright practically gave him an aneurysm by saying that acting as if our soldiers were toy soldiers, and that he patiently had to explain that to her. So I call him up, and I say, patiently? And he said, yes, you didn't understand anything. So he then sent me his book, and he signed it, Love, Admiration, etc., patiently, : and then I sent him a note back with Love, Admiration, etc., forcefully, Madeleine. But the point here is I was the only woman in the room. I was a mere mortal female civilian arguing with the hero of the Western world. And I think the hardest part is for an American civilian to argue with the military. And I had to do it again over Kosovo. And I think that that is why there needs to be more than one woman in the room. And having Toria as part of the system and part of it, and the more women that we get, so you're not the only person in the room. We might not all agree, but you're not at least the only person. By the way, Colin and I are very good friends, and we go through this, and somebody will say, so tell us about the aneurysm. So then I do the mere mortal female civilian. He goes, oh my God, again. But so we put on a pretty good act. But the bottom line is it is not easy. And I think you'll agree with this, Toria, of arguing with somebody in a uniform, and you are a civilian.
Absolutely. And by the way, the U.S. military was later extraordinarily proud of having helped to end, along with allies, and creating NATO's first combat success in the name of freedom in both Bosnia and Kosovo. And we managed to do it with diplomatic precision and military precision married together, because you and Saakashvili were very close. But the other piece here is that this is a human being who had memory of World War II and the genocide in Europe, and she knew what it meant when a killer is allowed to rampage across civilian territory, and she knew that it could spread and metastasize, and she understood the moral imperative of the United States playing a leadership role, and that nobody else would organize without us, because she had lived through it. So this is a matter of biography influencing history and the right person at the right time. And you know, the fact that she says she was 5'2", I think she was 4'11", even then. Foot woman, you know, stood up to the dude with the medals and convinced an entire room of the right thing to do. Speaks to the power of Wellesley women.
I do feel sorry for you guys that had to do a Bosnia thing.
They were scared. I had a Bosnia.
Because I think it really is something that has so many aspects to it, and the storytelling part, where in fact history can be manipulated, which is what Milosevic and Karadzic did to talk about the horrors that the Serbs suffered, and then trying to develop a different narrative later. Very hard, and Bosnia continues to be an issue in so many different ways. And I think it really, that and Kosovo goes to the point of what America's role in the world is. And I mentioned to some of you, and I'll say it again, is one of the most amazing moments was last summer when President Clinton and I went to Kosovo to honor the anniversary of the end of the war. And I have never, ever been to a place where I've seen so many American flags and signs all over that said, "Thank you, USA, thank you, USA," and a sense that we had done the right thing. And there's still a lot of work to do. By the way, they do now have a bust of me, but it's on a pedestal, so I'm tall. And what is interesting was one of the things, and I on the Kosovo War, and I say this often to my students, is that it is interesting how history can be interpreted and what you actually say. And so what happened was, I did believe that we needed to do something in Kosovo. And then one of the things, and again it goes specifically to the kind of presentations and arguments, you get so used to arguing within an internal argument, and the problem was that most people would say, well, this will be another Vietnam, a quagmire. And I was sure it wouldn't be. And so I got so used to saying that, and I was on TV right after the war started, and I said the war would be relatively short. What happened then was that when the Washington Post wrote it up, they left out the word relatively. Then what happened was that it didn't start well. The Serbs put out decoys. Then all of a sudden I come into my office and my exec says, "Sit down." I said, "What?" He said, "Just sit down." I said, "What is the matter with you?" And he said, "We've just bombed the Chinese embassy by mistake." And everything was going wrong, and they called it Madeleine's War. And when it went right, they called it something else. But the bottom line is that there's a whole generation now of young women in Kosovo whose first name is Madeleine. And so I do think it is important to stand up for what you believe in, no matter if you're the only woman at the table, but you have to know what you're talking about. And you know that, is that you can't bullshit. That's not the right thing to say.
Ooh, she cursed before I did. Can the record show, please? But I think this also...
It's just because I'm here with you.
Oh, I'm the catching one.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. But I also think this speaks to the conversation we've been having ever since, and to our friendship, which goes to the question of how do you define U.S. national interest? Do you define it in the extremely narrow terms and selfish terms that it's being defined now? or do you define it as we defined it at the end of the Cold War and beyond, and our generation is very proud of, in an expansive way of creating a community of free nations which keep the system open, which keep the system fair, which create opportunity for people on every planet that they might not otherwise have had, and that you have this power for a reason, to keep us safe, but you keep us safe by enlarging the community of those who are safe. So, you know, we had a lot of anguish together over things like Syria, which, you know, a democratic president's choice to do less, I think, than either you or I would have done. The experience and training I had under Secretary Albright informed how I did my job when the Ukraine crisis happened and we had to stand up to Russia. And I was accused in the Situation Room of maybe marching the United States into a shooting war with Moscow. Because I was suggesting training and other support for the Ukrainian military. So that values-based and interest-based approach to U.S. leadership in the world is something that I learned at the knees of the greats, but it's not always easy to fight for in a situation where doing something expedient and small and short feels easier and less politically risky, particularly for leaders you have to convince, right?
Do you think there's a path back towards that direction, given what's going on right now and the current context? Is it something that rises and falls? Is it something that needs to be driven by strong individuals who are placed in situations with given power? What's the path forward that you see?
Well, I think it is understanding what the role of the United States is. I think what is interesting, I do not see the United States as a victim. We're the most powerful country in the world. What is interesting is President Clinton is the first one that said we were the indispensable nation. I just said it so often it became identified with me. But there's nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. And by the way, Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables, and it ends in an ism. But all it means is partnerships. And I think that where the United States needs to come out again is to understand the value of partnerships. And Toria, having been at NATO and understanding the importance of an alliance relationship and the importance of partners, has to come again, and not to see us as victims of countries that are taking advantage of us because they don't pay. It isn't all about transaction. And so I think the question is, and I do think that especially at an institution such as this, there needs to be thinking about what America's role in the world is. We do not want to be the world's policeman, but we do understand our responsibilities. And I think that the reports that were done here, in one form or another, all of them kind of touch that. And I think the question is how to present it in a way to the American people. And I think that it is very important to understand domestic policy. And I read a letter to the participants that I just had been in this current issue of Time. Democracy is not a spectator sport. And people are counting on this generation to understand the current threats and step up and have a value system. And what is troubling to me, and I think you've been saying it also, is at the moment there seems to be just pragmatism or valueless system and transactional. And that is not America.
Selfishness.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, interestingly, in the last 3 years, U.S. public opinion of NATO and the United Nations, the preeminent multilateral institutions we're part of, has gone up year over year. Why is that? Why is it going up in Indiana and Wisconsin and Michigan? I think because Americans don't like the idea of going it alone. They like the idea of being part of a global family that is trying to solve problems. So I don't think it's all that tough a case to make if you don't use the ism word, if you simply use the word, more simple words, creating a community of common action, going and solving problems together. And this notion that we've somehow been ripped off by these alliances or by these trade agreements, just takes us back into a mercantile dog-eat-dog universe of 2 centuries ago, which is not going to keep us safer. So, I think but it requires leadership, and it requires the kind of president we had in Bill Clinton. And frankly, you may not like this in this room, but I felt George Bush 43 also had this ability to make the case that we're all in this together, whether it's fighting terrorism, whether it's expanding the community of free nations, whether it's dealing with climate, any of it. And we need leaders on every continent. And we don't have too many of them anywhere right now.
And I don't think it takes a brain surgeon to figure out that some of the issues require cooperation. Yes. There was a lot of discussion of climate change. We can stand on our head and think that something has to happen, but unless other countries are participants in that, nothing will. Or Ebola or whatever, various aspects that require that cooperation. And if it has to be described selfishly to some people, so be it. But the bottom line is, you can be a stable genius, but you do need to understand that it takes cooperation among countries to deal with international issues or terrorism, name them. And so that's what bothers me, is that there's this kind of sense that either America alone or America out. America's AWOL. I had just been in Morocco, and we were talking about that. And what was interesting was I went to a conference that the Canadians were running on immigration. And Louise Arbour is somebody that I got to know because she had been an international judge. And so she asked me to speak. And I look out at the audience, and the American seat is empty.
Wow.
America cannot be AWOL. And that is what is happening. We don't have to agree with everything, but we cannot be absent. And so I think, I do hope, and again, it just goes to the discussion we had, I hope that all the young people realize that they have to vote. That this cannot be a way of just deciding, well, we'll sit it out. It ain't going to go that way. And so I do hope that the things that are happening at Wellesley, we don't have to vote the same, but I do think that it is essential to participate in a democracy. And as I've said, it's not a spectator sport.
Thank you. So I want to make sure that there's a little bit of time, it sort of builds on these ideas of leadership that we've been talking about and building through this whole conversation. And I know both of you have experience in the private sector, sort of broadening the idea of leadership beyond government representation, but also with the private sector. Would love it if each of you could share some, advice or sort of vision about what Wellesley students or other students, how they may see leadership in the future in public service, but also more broadly. What kinds of leadership are sort of needed in the world? How can we sort of think in government positions, but also beyond that, and how that might be taken forward?
Well, I do think that we are not a country that only operates through the public sector. We are a democracy, and we believe in private activities. And I do think, by the way, I think that there's continuous learning. It scares people to think I learned something when I already was Secretary of State. But the bottom line is that the private sector is very important. And the private sector is composed of corporations, but also of non-governmental organizations or individuals. And the question is how to develop some kind of a partnership, since what we all do is problem solving. Victoria has problem solved. It is transferable to the private sector as well as the public sector. The issue is how to get the public and private sector to cooperate. And I've tried that. It's hard. There's no question about it. It's like two Lego pieces that don't fit. But I think the public sector does not have, in some cases, the knowledge base of everything, especially on technology, or the money, and that it's important to find ways of cooperating. And I happen to believe that the private sector has to learn how to be good local citizens wherever they are. In fact, I established a prize at the State Department to prove that, but I think that the private sector has a role, especially if it's run by women. And so I do think that there are ways that problem solving is a discipline, and I think it is worth looking at from that perspective. And Toria has left a long and very excellent career in the public sector, and I'm very happy to have her come join us in the private sector now.
Which is great fun. I think the issue goes to how do you live a life of purpose, right? I'm going to guess that's what most of you are thinking. And obviously, public service, serving your nation, serving your community, serving your state, serving a community of action on an issue that you care about, health or political or something else, is going to give meaning to your life, going to make it more fun to get up in the morning, going to make you willing to make those sacrifices to work hard and flex and all those things. I would say that in addition, I loved and was so proud to wear America's t-shirt for 32 years. But as I come out and work for Albright Stonebridge, it is, as the Secretary said, the same skills where you're trying to help a U.S. company that's trying to grow or trying to come up with a green strategy or trying to solve a regulatory problem with the government, have a coherent conversation. But in terms of life of purpose, you can be a journalist, you can be in the nonprofit sector, you can be in private business making a widget that changes lives, as long as you are ethical and thoughtful and creating community as broadly as you can wherever you go. So there shouldn't be judging about that. What's most important is that you're passionate and that you think that you are making positive change wherever you go with good people.
Thank you so much for that. So I think we've both given us so much to think about, not only about leadership on a global stage, pathways within that, different ways of doing it, and then kind of going beyond to think on multiple levels about what leadership might look like for women who will make a difference in the world, but more broadly as well. And I believe we now have some time set aside for questions from audience members, fellows, distinguished guests who happen to be here.
Hi, thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Anna Bayette, and I have the absolute pleasure of being an Albright Fellow this year. My question for you both has to do with values. And I know in working with these huge organizations, the UN and governments and in diplomacy, there's a lot of image at stake and a lot of kind of the values of the organization, which may or may not align with how you personally feel and the things you personally value. So I'm interested in how to ask hard questions and how to bring hard critiques to these organizations while still working from within them and not alienating the people that you need to be allies.
Fantastic, fantastic question, and a lifetime challenge for anybody in any organization. I will give you some State Department examples. You can find yourself on the Bosnia desk when we are refusing to do anything about the genocide in the early years, and a lot of people asked to be transferred to a different desk, and luckily the organization is ethical enough to allow that. You can be relatively proud of a policy that you're implementing, as I was in trying to support Ukraine and its struggles with Russia, but not be getting all of the pieces of policy that you think would make a difference or not getting them fast enough. And then you have to make the decision, do you walk away or do you keep pushing and making the case respectfully and in a U.S. interest-based way at the table? I chose the latter way, but there were people who chose the other way, and then there has to be respect and trust within that. But most importantly, you've got to know your own heart, and you've got to know where the line is for yourself, and that's a constant reevaluation. And you've got to be respectful, model the behavior that you want to see coming back at your way, and be persuasive and know your stuff. If you know your stuff, you're probably going to win at the table. That would be my answer.
I also think that one of the hard questions is, believe it or not, under what circumstances would you resign? And there is a dissident channel at the State Department where you can make your views known and not resign. But I remember very well, Cy Vance, one of my predecessors, died, and I went to his funeral. And the eulogy was about the fact that he'd resigned over the hostage crisis. And I thought, when I die, I don't want my eulogy to be that I'd resigned. And so the question is, under what circumstances would you? But are there things that you can do within the system that does not, in fact, undermine what your moral status is? And I do think, and one of the very hard parts to talk, especially to young people and students about, is that there's not always consistency in American foreign policy, that you sometimes have to make some kind of pragmatic decisions, and compromise is not a four-letter word. And I think that the issue is, how far do you go, would you go, not to go? And I think these are very important questions. You know, where does your real value system not allow you to go forward in something, and where are there ways that you can find a pragmatic solution to something? One of the things that I think's always been a problem with American foreign policy are discussions about, is it idealistic or realistic? And I think it's a false dichotomy, because I never could figure out if I was an idealistic realist or a realistic idealist. And so I decided that our foreign policy was a little bit like a hot air balloon. You needed the helium of idealism to get it up, and you needed the ballast of realism to give it a direction. And so one has to really understand what the issues are, how far can you go, and is compromise something that you can do, and is it a trade-off?
And just to say that I am somebody who walked away, 32 years doing something that I loved more than anything. And I just knew in my heart that what was going to be asked was not me. And it actually was so much easier than I thought. And all of my colleagues said I was nuts, and I sleep very well.
But I also do think that you pushed as hard as you could at a particular time on the Ukrainian stuff, as much as anything.
And there were things I didn't walk away from. I didn't walk away from the Iraq War. I wanted to make us better if we could. I didn't walk away from the tough times in Afghanistan. But there was just something that told me this was the time. So listen to your heart.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. My question is also a little bit about compromising, and specifically about the commercial diplomacy you were speaking about. And I wonder about, in your experiences working with foreign countries, in terms of forging private-public partnerships, to what extent do you think, because what if in circumstances when the local government has a pretty strong stance, to what extent in this partnership are you able to make impact and always standing for what is right to do? And can you speak a little bit more about the impact of the commercial diplomacy?
Just to say that among the things I love about the firm is that it's all about trying to create interest, as we do in diplomacy, with the other side. So you're going to that local government and trying to make the case to them that doing it in a more open way with the private sector is going to take them further in terms of the goals that they have. And you have to make that case by putting yourself in their shoes, the same as we do as diplomats, and trying to understand what's motivating them and finding those hooks. But the other thing I love about the firm is when we're asked to take a case that we consider unethical or that's going to take us to a place that doesn't feel right in terms of its impact on citizens. Even if we know we could probably convince that government, we don't take the case.
I think that it's very important to understand what the context is in which you are operating, and whether as a private firm doing commerce, you can influence things in a positive way. What I find very interesting is that one can see that sometimes the private sector can do things that the public sector cannot do because the receiving country wants whatever it is. I know you're Chinese, and so I think part of the issue is there are certain things that China wants, and a lot of it has to do within the health sector. And so it is something that is important to them, and they are willing to kind of look at a variety of things. But at the same time, you have to understand that you're not going to give up on some of the value system in terms of providing materials that allow you to get rid of people that you don't want, like girls, in terms of selection of what you would do about birth and a variety of things. So you have to understand the firm that you're dealing with. But I do think it is worth getting the private sector into some of the countries that are hard to deal with, because they need the private sector. And the private sector, if it is the right or company, they also are willing to take certain steps in order to have a good labor policy or health policy, or try to figure out how to be functional citizens in a country. But it's hard, and this is where the diplomacy part comes in, and we do walk away from things that are things that don't feel right, like selling guns or various aspects. But it is getting more complicated, and technology makes it more complicated. But it's a very hard issue, just the way other diplomacy is. Commercial diplomacy also has to kind of see what the effects are of the actions taken. And one of the hardest things in diplomacy and commercial diplomacy is not making a decision is a decision sometimes. And if you decide that you can't make a big decision, then you take an incremental step. And the bottom line is the incremental step sometimes already leads you down a road you don't want to be on. And so one of the things, and again, I thought about this as you were all making your presentations, you have to understand the unintended consequences of either making a decision or not making a decision, and really push yourself on that and not say, oh, it'll be okay. Because the unintended consequences, one of the presentations on Afghanistan, a lot of unintended consequences. And one of the stories, if I might tell, I was in the White House when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And we did not want the Soviets to do that for obvious reasons. We wanted to punish them, but we couldn't get them out. So there were various steps that were taken. But one of the craziest things that happened that had an unintended consequence, my boss, Zbigniew Brzezinski, wanted to go to Afghanistan. And he stood at the Khyber Pass with an automatic weapon, and he looked out at the crowd and he said, God is on your side. And it was the Mujahideen, and we then began to arm them. And I think that it's an unintended consequence. And so I think as you're making decisions, whether commercial diplomacy or real diplomacy, you have to push yourself to ask what the unintended consequence is.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amelia Foreman. I'm a fellow this year. Thank you so much for talking. Going off of the theme of unintended consequences, I was wondering what the role of the U.S. government would be if corporations are invited in and then they cause chaos, or what sort of propositions are there to curtail companies who do come in, and then what is the role of the United States that the United States would take for United States companies that cause harm? Is that something the government is supposed to then take on?
I mean, it obviously is very circumstantial if you have a U.S. company that comes in and is a massive polluter or a massive violator of labor rights or women's rights or child labor or any of those global standards that we all adhere to through the UN system. The government is going to protest, and then, occasionally the State Department may try to negotiate with the company, but probably we're going to side with the government in making it clear that that behavior is not acceptable. You know, sometimes the accusation against the company is unfair, or sometimes it is made in order to give preferential place to a local company that can't otherwise compete. So that's a different matter. And some of the work that we do has to do with making sure that the playing field is level and that these kinds of accusations can't be made without cause. But I've never seen a circumstance where the U.S. government, maybe in the Cold War period for geostrategic reasons, stood on the side of a predatory company. I mean, I don't know what we think about Facebook right now, but you know, what we're trying to do is help them to meet standards of good governance that are being asked of them by the countries that they're working in. So
I think it is a very hard time, especially with technology, without understanding fully what all the possibilities for technology is, and is it worth selling your soul to be someplace and say that you will turn over facts or something about people. And we happen to think that's, as a company, we don't think that's a good idea. I do think that there are remedies that the United States can take. We can sanction and make it very clear that certain companies should not be doing what they're doing. But it's the public-private sector part is a very complicated aspect of our system, and we don't want to tell companies what to do. We try to persuade them that it's not smart to do something. But that is kind of why this is a hard kind of aspect. And one of the reasons that we enjoy having somebody like Toria with us is that some of the issues are similar to diplomatic issues, where you need to try to find some kind of a solution without going to war or having a complete breakup, but have some kind of way of extricating companies or saying that there's certain rules that just don't work. So.
Thank you.
Good evening. How are you guys? My name's Lori Brutus. I study biochemistry and French. I'm so happy to see my professor on stage with you guys as well. I want to shift the conversation a little bit if I can. I'm going to take advantage and ask for life advice. So I am a senior, and I'm graduating this May. And last fall, I applied to multiple PhD programs for biomedical sciences. But I just want you guys to look back when you were graduating college, and is there anything that you wish someone told you? Do you have any advice for me? Yes, that's my question.
I mean, my advice is twofold. First of all, throw every net. You know, you can say to yourself, well, PhD program, I got to do that. And maybe you do in your field for the credential or for the legitimacy or for the next stage of learning. But I, first of all, always advise people to take a couple of years in the work world if you can. Just see how you feel, see what kind of human you are when you are making your own dinner and figuring out your own transport and all that kind of stuff. So that would be one thing. The second thing is, even as you pursue the obvious path, throw lots of nets in other directions too, because you don't know how you might feel. And then remember to check back in with yourself. Don't get on a path, don't get on a rat wheel where, 3 years later you're doing it because, rather than feeling passionate about it. And talk to a ton of people would be my advice.
I think that in some ways, this sounds crazy, but leaving college, getting a PhD seems to make a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And because it's the kind of thing you've done, and it's something that goes on in that particular way. But I think it's worth really thinking about. I got a PhD. It is a lot of work. And I think the question is whether it is something that then doesn't allow you to do the kind of thing that Tori is talking about, exploring and thinking about different aspects. And I do think that one of the issues is how to figure out what all the opportunities are. As I always say, I went to Wellesley sometimes between the invention of the iPad and the discovery of fire. And so things were a little bit different. And we had a very peculiar commencement speaker we all kind of remember this slightly differently. But it was Neil McElroy, the Secretary of Defense, because his daughter was in our class. And he basically said, your main responsibility is to get married and have children. The fact that we didn't walk out is a sign of the times. I took his advice. I got married 3 days after graduation. But I think basically what is important is, and I wanted to be a journalist, and then that didn't work out. And I think that one has to be flexible enough to be able to adjust and feel that you have made a choice that fits who you are at the time that ultimately leads to something else. But I think it's a mistake to just think, I've got a path, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm supposed to do, and to use the time in a creative way. So, although getting a PhD is a good idea in the end, because then they call you doctor, you know, so.
Sorry, as you were talking, Madeleine, I was just thinking, I get the, married 3 days after, although there's a great example of married 3 days after at this table that's still doing very well, so congratulations. I would just say to all of you, and I would say this if it were a room full of men and women, as you pursue your professional dreams and as you explore your life horizons, make room for love too. Make room for love and compromise for it if you need to. I'm somebody who dragged a man around the world to 3 different countries and had to make lots of different compromises. He made compromises for me. I made compromises for him. I wouldn't have had any of the professional fun I had if I hadn't been lucky enough to find that love partner too. So remember what Freud said: good love, good work. You need them both.
Thank you, guys. You're the best.
I think we have room for one more question.
Hello, my name is Maria Murtak, and I'm from Istanbul, Turkey. And you both mentioned the importance of...
Oh, Istanbul, you voted for a good mayor.
Yes, thank you. I think we did. So you both mentioned the importance of personal relationships and diplomacy. And my question is, let's say I'm a Turkish ambassador one day, and I walk into a room with someone that is maybe, like, due to historical reasons or other reasons, is ideologically going to disagree with me, let's say with an Armenian ambassador, and we have to agree on something. What would be one tip you would give me to start a conversation or create the atmosphere that we can come to a compromise in any topic?
I think one of the most important things is to put yourself into the other person's shoes. And there isn't always something that is a zero-sum game. There are win-win aspects, and you will find yourself often with people that you disagree with. But the question is to try to find that common ground. And as I said earlier, compromise is not a 4-letter word. There is a way to try to find a way, but the most important thing is really to put yourself into the other person's shoes. It was very interesting. President Clinton had an incredible talent for understanding people in a number of ways, and very much so. And when we were all at Camp David forever, he would bring us and said, put yourself into the other. What is it they want? Put yourself into those shoes. Now, in the end, you have to know what, as a diplomat, your responsibilities are. But I do think that there is the human aspect of it that is important. And you can actually have very good personal relations with countries and people that you disagree with. I became excellent friends with the Russians. Yevgeny Primakov. When I first became Secretary of State, given the fact that he had been part of the secret police aspect over there, I walk into his office in the Kremlin and he said, given my previous job, you do know that I know everything about you. But we developed a relationship where we could have functional conversations about what we were doing. We became good friends, and then we'd argue. And you're able to do something like that. And I think but it's the putting yourself into the other country's shoes. One of the things I do is, and I'll probably talk about this some tomorrow, I say every country makes foreign policy decisions based on 5 factors. And they are objective, where is the country? The Russians are the only country that actually changed borders, but mostly countries stay where they are, or they're resource-based. We changed our resource base. The second is subjective. How do the people in a country feel? Much harder to measure. The third is how the government is organized, in our case, executive, legislative relations or whatever. The fourth are bureaucratic politics that are reflected in the budget, and the fifth is the role of individuals. And I think it's very important to try to do the 5 factors for the country that you're sitting across from. And it's interesting, and you're going to be able to have to find that relationship. I spent a lot of time at the UN with Sergei Lavrov. And he could be very charming, and he could be perfectly awful. And the bottom line is trying to figure out how to still true. And by the way, I think I've told you this, I have warned every foreign minister I've ever run into, including American secretaries of state, to say that there is nobody that is smarter about how to manipulate the UN than Sergei Lavrov. He knows how to write the resolutions and where to put the commas so they mean something else. But I think it's important to know who you're talking to and put yourself into their shoes.
I agree with that completely. I think there are very few humans who wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to be pure evil. You know, everybody thinks that they are trying to do the right thing. They may start from a different place. Their definition of right thing may be different than yours. But how do you walk that path and see where the common ground is? And frankly, if you've already agreed to sit down at the table, that's the first step, right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I believe that we are at the end of this wonderful discussion. Thank you both so much for your time and insights.
Secretary Albright, Ambassador Nuland, Professor Radhakrishnan, thank you for just an extraordinary conversation from the highest level of really thinking about diplomacy to personal advice that I think our fellows will take to heart. And we just are so thrilled and thank you and so heartened by the conversation. Thank you. Before we end, I do want to, there was one special guest that I neglected to welcome and to thank, and that is President Diana Chapman Walsh. And President Chapman Walsh is the 12th president. For most of you know, but for our students, is the extraordinary 12th president of Wellesley. And I think it is so wonderfully fitting that she and the secretary are sitting next to each other, because it was really with the two of them together that the Albright Institute was born. And I just want to thank you for your vision together. Thank you for your leadership. And I do want to thank every person in the room who has given of their wealth, of their time, to really make the Albright Institute what it is today. So thank you, and have a wonderful rest of the evening, and we'll see many of you tomorrow. Thank you.